With many of the changes I've described above comes also a rapidly shifting kind of moral landscape in the country. The nation seems to be changing very quickly its ideas of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in society and what our expectations are. I mentioned the Scopes monkey trial as one bit of evidence of this kind of changing moral landscape. I'm going to talk about this over the next several slides, but I think we might just look at prohibition as perhaps a symptom of this, an underlying factor that influences a great deal about the way we think and act during this period. Prohibition was put in place in 1919. It banned the sale and public consumption of most kinds of alcohol, and in a lot of ways put the clamps on even normal or household consumption of alcohol. And yet, did we stop drinking? You all, I'm sure, have studied Prohibition to some extent or read and heard a little bit about it. Did Prohibition stop the country from consuming alcohol? Of course it didn't. Many historians have speculated that the country is drinking more during Prohibition than ever. We just had to change the ways we went about it. And in some ways, drinking simply went behind closed doors. It went into secret, either in within the home, within the parlors and living rooms in people's homes, or in the famous speakeasies of the day. If you look at the painting on this screen, this gives you a sense of some of the things I want to convey about this. Here you have some obviously very well-dressed, well-positioned people. We can imagine that they are wealthy and perhaps high-ranking individuals in society. We have two men and a woman, and yet they are sort of lurking in the shadows. They are engaged in some kind of clandestine activity. In this case, they are knocking on the door and giving the secret password to get into a speakeasy so they can drink and dance perhaps and smoke and party in this speakeasy. They're breaking the law. They are breaking the rules. And so one of the things I would propose to you is that Prohibition makes us a nation of lawbreakers, a nation of rule breakers. We might make a parallel to speeding regulations on the highways today. And we all see the speed limit signs. Have any of us ever exceeded the speed limit? Any of us ever driven faster than we should have? Some of us, I don't mean myself necessarily, but some of us break the law all the time. We sort of ignore those laws or take them as simply perhaps a suggestion. Prohibition is kind of the same way. The country en masse ignoring the law of the land, ignoring prohibition. And so we become a nation of lawbreakers. And if we're going to break that law, if we're going to break those customs, well, why not change the way women are dressing and wearing their hair? Why not change the way we are behaving and acting in other elements of American society? So I think prohibition is both a symptom and a factor in the rapidly shifting moral landscape of the 1920s. You see the other picture on the screen, of course, is Al Capone, who represents another angle on this idea of prohibition. Al Capone made a fortune as one of the leading gangsters of this era, and he, in fact, is profiting on the fact that the country is ignoring the laws of prohibition. Al Capone making a fortune selling us the booze and the alcohol that we cannot necessarily obtain legally, and so we have to obtain it illegally. And Al Capone, while he engages in all kinds of nefarious and reprehensible activities and is credited with many acts of horrific violence and other terrible things, becomes something of a public well, hero is too strong a word because it suggests the positive element, but he's certainly a celebrity in that era. He's a well-known figure, and many, many Americans are willing to sort of look the other way and tell themselves that Capone isn't really hurting anyone by what he's doing. So let's talk about some of the examples of these changing morals of the 1920s, and certainly the role of women and the behavior of women in this era is one of the best known examples of this. And we think specifically in the 1920s of what are known as the flappers. Women who wore thin dresses, short-sleeved or sleeveless, with short skirts, at times approaching scandalous levels of skin being revealed, and this accompanied by a variety of other behaviors. Where does the word flapper come from? I think the instinctive response is that it applies to the dresses of women, that sometimes that were beaded or something like that, and they would kind of flap around. And while that's true, the phrase flapper itself actually is derived from an English word or a British word. A flapper was a nickname for a young duck, which would, they sort of flop around. They're learning about themselves. They're growing and sometimes sort of awkwardly growing into themselves. The famous American journalist and writer named H.L. Mencken described the flapper this way: a somewhat foolish girl, full of wild surmises and inclined to revolt against the precepts and admonitions of her elders. And so there you have the flapper. Dresses were certainly getting shorter during this time. You see that reflected in both of the pictures on this screen, but more so the one on the right. Historians have actually done studies of the length of women's skirts during this time and discovered that in 1919 the average lady's hem was about 6 inches off the ground, so ankle length or so. By 1920, just a year later, the average skirt was about 12 inches off the ground, somewhere mid-calf or so. By 1927, it was 16 to 18 inches above the ground, around knee length. And so certainly women are wearing shorter dresses and much more free and flowing dresses. They are literally throwing off the restraints of society that society had put upon them. The corsets, the very high-necked dresses, buttoned all the way to the top. They're literally throwing those things away. This is there's a great metaphor at work here, in addition to the literal and actual changes in clothing. They are figuratively or metaphorically throwing off all of those restraints and restrictions of society. The same is true of the popular haircuts of the day. Many, many women were cutting off their hair, wearing bob haircuts or very short hair. And again, this is kind of symbolic of the restraints that long hair... my wife attests to this. Any woman knows when your hair is much longer, it takes much more time. It's cumbersome. It's heavy. You've got to work out all the knots and everything else. And so women in the 20s just cutting their hair off, it gives them much more time, much more freedom, and they're able to move around much easier. The cosmetics industry, the beauty industry, as I mentioned earlier, booming during this time. Women are going out much more, and so they are wearing makeup much more frequently and prominently. By 1930, women are spending more than $1 billion a year on makeup, and the average woman is going through more than a pound of face powder each year. And I'm not exactly sure how much that is compared to what women wear today, but it sounds like an awful lot when you're talking about just makeup. Each of these changes is indicative of a change in the feminine ideal in the 1920s. Women are no longer pursued because of their curvaceous nature. Prior to the 1920s, a more busty or bodacious woman was considered ideal because men were looking for a woman who would be a mother to his children, a wife in the home. In the 1920s, we don't think of the flappers as perhaps ideal mothers, or that might not be the first thing that comes to mind. Men are looking for women who are going to have fun, who are going to go dancing, who are going to be out in society and perhaps not raising their children. And we see this reflected in the behaviors of the day as well. The dancing of the 1920s becoming much more sort of scandalous in nature. If you think about dancing prior to this era, and you think about sort of ballroom-style dancing, the waltz, there's always a very carefully observed space between the two dancers. You have your arms around the other's waist or shoulder, perhaps, but you are not leaning into them, you're not touching them in any kind of suggestive way. By the 1920s, we're talking about the foxtrot. We're talking about the Charleston, where kind of leaning into and out of each other's space is the whole nature of the dance. And these kind of dances could be more or less kind of scandalous and suggestive, depending on where you were doing the dancing. Women are also smoking and drinking in much larger numbers during this era. These were previously sort of male preoccupations, but in the age of the speakeasy, in the age when the drinking and the socializing and the partying comes into your home, women must be part of this process. No longer is this just men going down to the saloon at the corner. We are going into people's homes, we are going into the parlor, and so women are becoming much more a part of this process. And I suppose it should be no surprise that with all of this flirting and public behavior and dancing and suggestive activity, that divorce rates are on the rise in the 1920s. Nowhere near the rates that we approach today, something more than 50% of all marriages ending in divorce. In 1910, the divorce rate was about 8.8%. So less than 1 in 10. By 1920, it was about 13%. By 1930, almost 17%. So we're approaching 20% of society experiencing a divorce. And along with that, divorce is becoming more acceptable in society. Prior to the 1920s, a divorce for a politician, for instance, might be a death sentence. For almost anyone, you would never get remarried again. You were sort of crippled socially. But with more and more marriages ending in divorce, more and more people experiencing a divorce, it's becoming a more accepted process in the country. Why do we see the moral landscape shifting so rapidly in the 1920s? Well, there are many different reasons for it of varying degrees of importance, but we can look at a number of different things contributing to this change. World War I contributes to the changing morals in a number of different ways. First of all, there is this sort of carefree attitude associated with people going away to war and coming home from war. Young couples saying goodbye for what may be the last time. Throwing care to the wind. If you thought you only had one more night to live, what would you do? Would you follow all the rules? Would you abide by all the same restrictions you always had? Or would you say, well, let's live it up. We've got one more night together. The same is true of soldiers returning home. There is an excitement, a euphoria as these couples are reunited. And so the kind of moral restrictions of the past are being put aside to some extent. The women's movement, which was flourishing during this time, and I mentioned in the previous lecture some of the impact of World War I here as well on the roles of women in society. They're asserting their independence, more women working, and the women's movement achieving the great victory of the 19th Amendment, which is passed in 1920. Women now having the right to vote. And so, in some real and significant ways, women are achieving a sense of equality with men in society. The idea that men are superior and women inferior is becoming a thing of the past during this time. Women are also gaining a much greater degree of freedom in the home. And we talked a little bit about the proliferation of appliances and gadgets around the home that are making housework and cooking and all of these other things much quicker and easier. We might look at that as with almost a laugh and think that, you know, these are sort of neat and interesting developments. But for the women who are now presented with these conveniences and appliances, they become a dramatic change in the way women were able to live their lives. Imagine trying to do the laundry without laundry machines. You're washing it by hand, great painstaking and time-consuming process. Imagine trying to clean the house without a vacuum cleaner. Imagine trying to cook without a microwave oven or any number of other appliances. In the past, women literally spent all of their time, their entire days, going through these kinds of chores. Now, these modern appliances and modern gadgets coming along, saving them an hour here, an hour there, 2 hours here, and suddenly women are looking around and realizing that they have half the day to do other things with themselves. So what kinds of things are they going to do? Well, many of them begin entering the workforce, as we have discussed. Starting to see more and more women taking jobs, expanding to some extent the kinds of jobs that they are able to do out in society. But with that work comes more money, their own money. Women are not necessarily tied anymore to their husbands who have to give them an allowance or give them permission to buy this or that. Women now have their own money, and they can purchase things that they want and in some ways do the kinds of things that they want. Another factor was the much greater prominence of the ideas and writings of Sigmund Freud. This was a major fad in the 1920s, people reading up on Sigmund Freud. He had been well known in Europe dating back to the late 19th century. But with World War I and millions of Americans going abroad for the war, they are exposed to his ideas, and by the 1920s, they're becoming very much a topic of discussion in the country. I'm no expert on the teachings of Freud and the psychology involved, but in essence, a lot of it comes back to sort of primordial urges, childhood urges, and in many cases, acting out sexual desires and fantasies. And by the 1920s, a lot of people are talking about this, and a lot of people are acting on these kinds of teachings. I mentioned as well prohibition and the role that perhaps prohibition plays in the creation of this kind of nation of rule breakers. And perhaps now you can see this is coming within a broad array of changes in society. It's only one, but collectively these things are leading us to kind of change very rapidly our approach to life. The automobile, contributing to this sense of freedom and experimentation as well. I mentioned very briefly in a previous slide the idea of dating prior to the automobile. How would you even date? Well, a typical date before the automobile came along meant that you would go to the home of your boyfriend or girlfriend and sit in the parlor with the parents and just engage in conversation, perhaps sharing tea or something like that. What a nightmare that would be, right? With the automobile, now young couples have the freedom. They don't have to sit in the home and in the parlor with their parents watching them. They can drive off somewhere. They can go to the movies. They can go to the park. And they can sort of experiment in a private environment. There is also, during this period, a proliferation of what I call here sex magazines, confession magazines, racy films coming out of Hollywood. And I don't mean necessarily pornography, although there is a very kind of just the beginnings of that industry as well. What I mean, though, by these sex magazines, another major fad in the 1920s, is that you would buy this magazine, and the vast majority of the magazine, 40, 50 pages, would be tales of housewives engaged in the kind of questionable activity, or all sorts of different kinds of sins and misdeeds going on, described in very illicit and racy detail. And then at the very end of the magazine would be sort of a disclaimer or a warning that, you know, these kinds of activities are going to wind you up in hell, and you don't want to do that, and, you know, certainly avoid that kind of behavior. These sorts of magazines and books are selling off the shelves. They're selling by the millions, and people are reading them in droves. Are they reading them for the moral message on the last page? No. They're reading them for the racy content within that gets them all excited. And Hollywood as well is contributing to this in some ways. Now, certainly the films being produced in that era don't remotely approach the kind of scandalous and racy material that appears routinely on screen today. But in that era, even showing kind of the silhouette of a woman through a window who might be changing her clothes or something like that would have been scandalous and very sort of erotic material by the standards of that day. Or just seeing a couple engaged in kissing or an embrace on screen would have been very erotic at that time. And so we see these kind of films contributing as well to the shifting morals of the day. Here are the words of one girl commenting on the role that these Hollywood films played. "Those pictures with the hot love making in them, they make girls and boys sitting together want to get up and walk out. Go off somewhere, you know. Once I walked out with a boy before the picture was even over. We took a ride. But my friend, she all the time had to get up and go out with her boyfriend." So these are some of the forces changing the moral landscape during the 1920s.